Hi, I'm Filipe Felizardo. Super happy to be here. Apparently, super nervous, but okay. So, just an introductory note. I was placed in this group of talks related to education, and this comes from a place where I think, abolishing school is a bit of an explosive thing to say, to suggest, and one has to explicate a lot what one means when one says let's abolish school. So this is in the ambit of extending learning beyond schools, which would be an alternative of that. Okay. My presentation is called "Labor is not, quote, logic symbol for negation, unquote, enough." In order to reply to the question, is there a bridge from rule following to a Marxist pedagogy, besides replying affirmatively, it would be required to at least speculate how so. We would have to ask what are rule following and a Marxist pedagogy. Helped by the conference organizer's question, I'm in for Marxist pedagogy and is not rule following. Hopefully a good start and an illustration of what will follow. So speculation of this bridge will involve mathematizing facets of the relevant conceptual frameworks in order to find out how they can reach each other. The investigation of how thought can think has been the territory of logic, and which is one of the fields of mathematics. There is, though, a persistent popular notion that the converse is the case, and that also logic is pure, outside of which people cannot think. This is also grievously opposed to another notion, that thought develops logics that make intelligence intelligible to itself. The former remains unexamined, and the latter invites us to inquire if there is a logic that can think itself. Mathematization is not conforming to the forms, fixed and eternal. It is a decanting of forms, a transformation. The task is to understand these objects as functions, processes, how they, us among them, synthesize and express themselves. Following Sellers in his essay, The Soul as Craftsman, the forms are a system of patterns, come recipes, come ingredients, unquote. Germs for intelligibility. If there is a logic to the realm of the forms, it is shaped as a system of practical truths about how life is to be lived and how the materials of the world are instruments for the construction of this good life. My interest in this is that Plato's logic, as Sellers saw it, is not formal. It is not exclusive to the relations between the forms. The joints of the world are not formal only. They are, Sellers says, the relations of one, possibility and compossibility, and two, the intelligibilities of action/life. As I understand it, the joints are synthetic. For carving the world at the joints, thus crafting the soul, we require a logic of synthesis. So crafting the soul here is the formation of reason, the forming of young minds, etc. If in pedagogy we are talking about the crafting of soul, there is another sense in which Sellers' Plato is helpful. In the Timaeus, the soul is, quote, as unique and irreducible as the forms, as space, as physical becoming, unquote. An intimation that the world soul is identifiable with a divine craftsman, that souls making their own bodies, the world soul makes the body of the world. Further, the soul is not made. There is no pattern of soul. quote, for patterns are to make things by, unquote. As well, physical becoming is not made. It is rather, quote, raw material for design, unquote, of the world's body. It comes to be spontaneously without design, though it is the ultimate raw material As well, physical becoming is not made. It is rather raw material for design of the world's body. Seller's greatest speculation here is that there are no patterns of the elemental powers, and though there are forms. Although there is no pattern for the soul, there is a form of the soul, and there are patterns of the kinds of soul. In other words, although soul is not made from a more basic raw material, souls are themselves raw material for craftsmanship. I am positing that the raw materials in the synthesis of the world soul and the world animal are what we designate as patterns or regularities in a Salarzian naturalized normativity framework. And the forms would be the rules for such regularities. The hard version of this would call them laws. There is thus a dialectic between pattern and form, and it mirrors, as we'll see, one between pattern and norm. But to advance the naturalistic conundrum of my identification of form and rule, I'll misappropriate a quote from Jaroslav Peregrin, who is talking about norms. And the quote is, "A rule has the features of an imperative," unquote. This is to remind myself to be careful in the contemporary context of popularization of evolutionary psychology, biological arguments for the necessity of procreational slavery, the over and under determination of social roles, and sadly, so on. A rule has the features of an imperative is not a rule is an imperative, nor a rule is imperative. So I'd rather suggest a rule has the features of an imperative until it does not. If I'm advancing an ideal of learning, this is it. Also, we have to think about what is at stake in a Marxist pedagogy. What would make it Marxist? Negatively and abstractly, to indoctrinate against social domination. Positively, how would this be thought out through labor? Is labor a form or a pattern, among others, raw material for craftsmanship? Is labor natural and somehow imperative? I have to tease out something that goes against the grain of what Moishe Poston calls traditional Marxism. That said, let us see how Ewald Ilienkov described labor. Labor, the real transformation of the world around man and of himself, which is performed in socially developed and socially sanctioned forms, is just the process, beginning and continuing, completely independent of thought, within which the ideal is engendered and functions as its metamorphosis. Idealization of reality, nature, and social relations is completed, and the language of symbols is born as the external body of the ideal image of the external world. Close quotes. So we must bear in mind that the entirety of the chapter presiding this definition of labor is summed up in the sentence actually preceding the one I just quoted, which is, man exists as man, as the subject of activity directed to the world around and to himself, from such time and so long as he actively produces his real life in forms created by himself and by his own labor. So I'm seeing a distinction here between activity and labor. So the suggestion will be that the contingency of labor makes it one of the patterns of the form of activity. In traditional Marxism's framework, labor is naturalized. I do not see this at work in Ilienkov. I see room for a distribution of the concept of activity across natural instances, species, in different degrees, and for understanding that such different degrees are four different expressions of activity, so of the engendering of the ideal. While the Homo sapiens' degree of activity itself has afforded labor, nothing forecloses that it may metamorphose labor itself. There is a contingent door for activity to do away with labor. Why would I like it so? Because the naturalization of labor has been reified to the point where it destroys the possibility of activity, facilitating the destruction of the world. In various instances, traditional Marxism has seen the very form of the human as enabled through the pattern of labor. To give an example, when Majdansky and Oitinen paraphrase Mezhuev, one of Ilinkov's students, they suggest that some sort of return to a natural state of labor is desirable. Quote, Marx discussed the alienation of objective wealth, which is created by people's activity from its creators. In these circumstances, the very activity loses its free, creative, universal character. In the abstract labor of a factory worker, freedom, creativity, and culture itself die away. And this is the dangerous part to me. The purpose is to bring labor back to the bosom of culture. Close quotes. So Ilyinkov himself points to how in Marx, quote, the reduction of different kinds of labor to uniform, simple labor devoid of differences is, quote inside quote, an abstraction which is made every day in the social process of production. Close both quotes. Better known nowadays as real abstraction. The glitch is the desire to bring labor back to the bosom of culture when the midwife of culture and the realizer of an emancipation from nature is not labor, but activity. We must clarify activity, of course. For Ilyinkov, activity is not an empirical, but a logical category, which suits my purposes, given it appears to fulfill the previous requirements of synthesis. So Ilyinkov first mentions activity in his definition of the ideal in 1962. The ideal is the, quote, determinate being of an external thing in a phase of its entering into the activity of the human subject, unquote. In Majdansky and Oitinen's words, the ideal is the form of a thing that has been separated from its own matter in the process of human activity. In order to avoid the conundrums of logical hylomorphism and the gluttony of logical demarcation, I'd like to take as a Sellers/Plato pattern what Majdansky and Oitinen call form. So the ideal is one pattern among other patterns of the form of activity. And as such, it is an abstract moment in a concrete interaction. For Ilyinkov, thought is a practice, the synthesis of abstract and concrete. Paraphrasing him, I claim activity is the process through which the instances of the form of the human transform external nature and themselves in the material aspect of labor and the ideal aspect of thought. This in order to be able to claim that to generalize the role of labor implies the asphyxiation of thought. As you may have already suspected, I'm trying to lead this into being able to say that activity is craftsmanship, and in doing so, I also hope to be able to say that logic has a place in craftsmanship. If I claim that craftsmanship is the development of patterns from the forms, I think it may work. One cannot transform matter without doing such transformation of form. If we insist on labor as the single, only way of transforming matter, we are insisting on one single pattern of developing the forms. We are thinking always the same. That is the logic of abstract domination. So how can we learn to not be abstractly dominated? Is the logic for emancipation to be found in nature? Following Sellers and Plato, it appears that nature comes from certain forms, certain rules. The speculative gist of my presentation whirls around this. I take certain rules present in animal cognition as natural processes. A system of patterns come recipes, come ingredients. Germs of craft, germs of logic, particular instances of techne distributed across species. After all, Ilyankov's notion of activity gives itself over to more than the Homo sapiens. Some of you here may have read Jaroslav Peregrin's book, Normative Species. I have to be very careful because the Platonic pattern is an ontological category, and Peregrin's is a descriptive term of the sort of regular behavior exhibited in natural species that I would say conforms to a form. Also, when Peregrin insists norm and rule are interchangeable words for the same concept, doesn't help me, especially given he then spends the whole book using rule for norm. So between ourselves, by rule, I mean form. By pattern, I mean the ontological subcategory of the recipe. So this is one we can keep. By norm, I mean second nature, social custom. In the book, Peregrin suggests that norms have contingently developed from what I call forms. With this in mind, I'm going to do something very dangerous and paraphrase Peregrin, and substituting the terms according to my vocabulary. So we have pattern-conforming behavior, which is a behavior that is merely regular. We have 2, pattern-governed behavior, which occurs because of a pattern. 3, norm-governed behavior, occurring because of norms. Norm-enacting behavior as 4, also called norm-following, occurring because the individual who displays it has a know-how. 5, norm-obeying behavior, note also called norm-following. There are 2 aspects for norm-following. Note that norm-governed behavior arises out of a certain mixture of pattern-conforming and norm-following. This is still Peregrin. There is an enforcer who follows norms. She knows them, be it merely know-how, and strives to do what they require. And there is an enforcee who comes to display a pattern because she is enforced into it. The distinction to be made is mostly between pattern-governed behavior, the bee dance, norm-governed behavior. Peregrin's example would be the linguistic behavior of human infants who still do not understand language, and norm-following, my keeping to the allotted time for this presentation. We can say that activity is present in all the 5 steps, in all those 5 steps, and gets more complex as we hit norm-following. But the fact that labor can be turned on at norm-following behavior, so at stage 4, the fact that labor can be turned on does not mean that labor caused norm-following. Mixing the operations, I think, causes the glitch. As Peregrin notes, there is a dialectic between norm-following and pattern conformity, resulting in norm governance. Which furthers my point. If labor is over-determining in this dialectic, norm-following begets pattern conformity without any self-governance. I think that self-conscious activity only happens at the 2 levels of norm-following, enacting and obeying. Those are the springboard for another concept of learning. So, I'm very much suggesting that there is a germ of logic in pattern-governed behavior. Triangulating the future position of a moving prey appears to involve an inkling of Hegel's sense certainty. This here too. What I would build upon this is that labor operates as a very brutal formal logic, replicated from such germ, abstractly negating the world. Such logic can only be said to predict preordained intelligibility. The concomitant claim is that activity, especially the multimodular degree in which it is present in Homo sapiens, may develop determinate negation from this natural baseline either or. Hence, it can realize further intelligibility. Against labor, activity can make patterns, norms, and forms explicit to the one governed by them. One becomes enabled to change one's behavior, that is, to determine oneself and nature, the world soul and the world body. Sellers famously said that the stuff of the manifest image of the human, while it can be causally reducible to the scientific image, it is not logically reducible to it. So what's up with our logic if it cannot help us understand how some things hang together in order for other things to be causal? The move may be to look for a refined logic. Interestingly, for Ilienkov, the logic of objective, what he calls objective activity, is dialectical, whereas the logic of sign symbolic, which he calls subjective activity, is formal. I think that is historical bad luck for Ilienkov. Fortunately for us, we can have a formalized logic that comprehends dialectical logic, having taken shape in France since the 80s. While I have excised the technical features of Jean-Yves Girard's linear logic from this presentation, I can still share that it appears the best tool for bridging the emancipation of the soul. Features of linear logic. It operates through networks instead of axiomatically foreclosed deductive trees. Rules, the norms of thought, can be localized inside the global network. Axioms are revisable. The use of the tool of cut elimination allows for sort of redundancy. That is, the particular cannot be abstracted into the singular. It features, among others, a logical operator for determinate negation. I would say it studies processes, not objects. And so it's not about purity, but change. And the fact it admits contingency makes it an historical logic. The conclusion is that activity, as we've seen it, as I've tried to show it to you, is a process. That activity is a process, makes it a rule or a form. While it has the features of an imperative, unlike labor, it gives itself to the interrogative. That, I think, is what is required of a pedagogy of possibility, of dialectical transformation and self-determination in the middle of historical contingency. And in turn, that is what I think Sellers hinted at in The Soul as Craftsman, when asking for a logic of blending and clashing of forms. Pedagogy moored in the framework of labor, and so it is my contention of formal logic, does not negate enough. It only stalls the active flourishing of intelligence, excluding intelligence into abstract unintelligibility. And that's it. Any questions?
Thanks, Filipe. Okay.
You're going to kill me, right?
So you've got the interesting focus there on, so I take it that you kind of, if we bring it back to a vision of education should be about like patterning of forms. So is it about like allowing the students to like So you've got this process, like like a craftsman would take some form and then they express their intelligence through the pattern, right? As opposed to kind of like capitalism, which kind of like in labor, like labor produces its own pattern. So yeah, basically, I'm just curious if we brought it back to the level of the student. Like, is the idea that a student is doing their own patterning? And then, yeah, my other question was just like, I'm not really clear, like, bringing in logic, who's that for? Is a student supposed to have mastery of logic to better pattern the forms? Like, who's the logic for?
Thanks for both parts of the question. Who's that for? Well, that one first. I think that's for anyone who wants to think about what is the logic of pedagogical frameworks. What kind of logic are we applying when setting up schemes for learning contexts? And yeah, that wasn't very clear because it's part of the research I've been doing. I've been trying to posit that a so-called universal, the vulgar, what I call vulgar universalist pedagogical framework operates under formal logic. So there are free-floating axioms and a limited set of things you can deduce from it, and other things that are either affirmed or negated until eternity. So when we use that kind of framework in learning environments, what I think happens is that students are obliged to conform. What happens is that they either fall in this grid, in this axiomatic grid, or they're out. The proposal here is not to say there is a lot of background knowledge and children, young minds just know things all of a sudden, but the idea is to propose a logic that makes their answers and their questions participate in the learning process. And I don't think that there's a lot of description of what happens logically so there are not a lot of descriptions of what happens in interaction in a classroom. In this sense, in the sense of what logic is operating in the instructor's head and in the learner's head. I hope this answered your question.
As I understood, I thought that it was a very good presentation for me, very interesting to me. I just wanted to ask, it's not just about education, since you are talking about activity, right? So, and I take it from what you said that there's a kind of there's a desideratum to liberate labor in the direction of activity in a certain sense. And I think Kirill's question was on point, like, do everybody needs to know logic or something like that? So this brings me to my actual question, which is about militancy in a certain sense. What would be the program for liberating activity in that sense? Because labor, in a certain sense, is about the division of tasks, right? If you remember, we discussed this before about Zonrattel, for instance, the way he reads Taylorism and Fordism, which is, completely kind of alienated kind of labor, but at the same time, it makes the possibility of getting to a society of production, in the sense that the productive process may be, the control of the productive process may be kind of, the control can be divided among the players, So there is a problem there about a kind of a mereology of the subject that is doing the activity. Is the subject one, or is the subject the whole productive process in a certain sense? If it's the whole productive process, you are kind of back at labor, but at the same time, I don't see how you can practically get yourself out of the idea of the division of labor. So in order to have only one as one person, one subject, a grasp of the whole kind of dialectical logic that you are proposing in a certain sense. So my interest is what would be, I could pare all that down to the question, boil it down to the question, what is the social synthesis for that?
What is the social synthesis?
The social synthesis of that process, because it seems like, the practical side of it is kind of obscure, and the political kind of, the politicizing kind of, the militancy for that is kind of obscure, outside of course, the idea of pedagogy, the idea of,
I knew it, yeah.
Yeah, you knew it.
I knew this could only stand here.
Yeah, because...
I thought of preceding the presentation with, this is only about pedagogy. No, but those are really good questions. I interrupted you. Had you finished? And I'm not equipped at all to answer those aspects. If anyone else wants to contribute to this question?
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment, which... So yeah, I had similar questions. I'm sure many of us might have as well. But what you're bringing out, I think, maybe gets at a tension between the development of productive forces, right, historically speaking, and maybe obviously the thing that's germane in capital and relative to alienated labor, which is that the development of those very forces estranges us from our Gattungswesen, right? So there's a tension there to be worked out, I guess, which is maybe points to maybe something you're seeing in the problem of labor here. But I had also questions about the sort of historical, where you're placing the historical marker for labor relative to human activity in general, I guess.
Good one.
I had one other question, if I can, or
Okay.
if not, you want to get to Anil's question?
Yeah,
right?
it would be good.
Sure, yeah. It's related. So, Filipe, if you could go back to your sort of hierarchy of capacities, starting from like the pattern conforming all the way to sort of fully normative. Do you know which slide I'm talking about?
Yeah. This one.
So maybe this is related to Neil's question. I didn't read the whole thing, but it seems maybe relevant. So I'm just curious, where you're placing activity here. You said it starts with number one, right? Or maybe I misread you, but I'm just curious whether or not activity requires some kind of something more than mere pattern conforming behavior. Just because, atoms are pattern conforming, right? But I wouldn't call them it depends on your ontology, I guess. But just maybe something to think about there as well. Thanks.
I think I can address this second question. Because though I noted it down, historical marker for labor, that's a good thing to, provide next time I try to suggest this. Cheers. Pattern conforming, yes, atoms may very well be pattern conforming, I think this part of the bullet point describes behavior. So I think I'm talking about behavior more than I'm talking about pattern conformity. When I say that activity is everywhere over here, what I'm trying to explore is that this notion that activity is distributed across species, and they are subspecies that are the species that are capable of meaning are that are capable of participating or in the ideal, in what Ilyenkov calls the ideal. Those are the ones I would say have certain degrees of activity, germs of activity. And in that sense, that opens up a certain subset of biology that that has these 5 levels, that reaches sometimes level 5 and or below that.
We'll very quickly
Thanks.
come to Anil's question as well. So, a related follow-up question: what kind of autonomy should a Marxist pedagogy aspire to? It seems at an extreme end of the spectrum, we've got anarchist pedagogy. It sounds like you're not against methods, to quote Fairbairn, giving you a reference to Girard. So, what's the kind of role of autonomy in your picture?
Thanks, Anil. This is a very good question. I'm not against method, of course, and I would not like this to lead into an anarchist pedagogy. I'm fried. I can't answer. It's like the words are just floating inside my head.
We'll continue. We've got 3 days to continue the discussion. I think we'll certainly come back to autonomy again and again. But yeah, interesting to know. Yeah, how does the student have autonomy?